Hello, welcome to Denton's Tales of the Viking Age. In this video, I'll be looking at the practice of magic in the Viking Age, especially the Volur, plural, or Volva, singular. Women who were very important in Old Norse society, having a prominent place in not just religious practice, but in the everyday lives of the people. Their influence was felt in agriculture and trade, in matters of health or wealth, in war, on the farm, in just about every aspect of daily life in the Scandinavian lands. They were female shamans, seers, or you can call them seeresses if you want, though seer as a term is applicable to both male and female, simply meaning one who sees. It isn't gender specific. And they practiced a form of magic known as seiðr. Now, to fans of the popular Vikings TV show, the mention of a seer probably brings to mind an ancient, desiccated and blind individual, somewhat resembling an animated Egyptian mummy. But that's wrong on two counts. Firstly, there was no requirement for a seer to be blind, since, though blindness was always regarded as improving the other senses of hearing, smell, and so on, which indeed it does, it was not a requirement for magic. Nor was it necessary for a seer to look as if they'd just been resurrected out of a tomb in the Valley of the Kings. And secondly, the seer in the TV show is a man. Though under all that makeup, it might be rather hard to tell. The Volur were almost exclusively women. And had the seer of Kattegat been a man, he would hardly have been regarded with the great respect and reverence shown in the TV series. In fact, he could well have been jeered by many people, for reasons I'll come to in a moment. And of course he would probably have given young children nightmares. The term Volva means wand carrier, or one who bears a staff, deriving from a word meaning a staff, since a wand or a staff was the symbol of these women, frequently the distaff used in spinning, and examples of these have been found in graves across Scandinavia. Before we continue, however, just to clarify something, people have asked if Volva and Volva are related terminology, since they are similar in sound. No, they have nothing whatever in common. Volva comes from Latin, meaning a covering, and so being Latin in origin and also having no connection whatsoever with anything magic, it has no relevance with regards to Norse shamanism. No, people do ask these things. Practitioners of seiðr were known as seiðrkonur, or seiðr women, or seiðmorder, seiðr men. Not that there were very many of those. And they were also referred to as spåkona, meaning prophecy woman, coming from spår, prophecy, and kona, woman, since that was part of their abilities to look into the future and to make prophecies. Now, the first Volva was said to be none other than the goddess Freyja, she having brought that magic art to Asgard, or Asgard as it is in English, when she joined the Aesir gods there. The practice said to have been common among the Vanir gods, of which she was a member, but pretty much unknown among the Aesir. That, I suppose, gave the Volur an added position of respect among the people, since their art was from the great goddess herself. A direct link, you might say, between the gods of Asgard and the humans of Midgard, something that in itself set them apart, regardless of anything they might actually do. And even Odin himself, of course, had sought out a dead Volva to obtain information from her, travelling down to hell on his great eight-legged horse Sleipnir to consult her. There were two tribes or races, if you like, of gods, the Vanir and the Aesir, and early on they fought a great war, the Aesir fighting principally with weapons, while the relied heavily on magic. Eventually they got tired of the continuous fighting, since neither side was getting anywhere. They had reached a stalemate, and they agreed a truce, which was accomplished in typical Norse fashion, cemented with an exchange of what might be considered hostages. Two gods from the Aesir, Heinir and Mimir, went to join the Vanir, while from the Vanir came three to Asgard, Njolde and his two children, his son Freyr and his daughter Freyja. Though a Vanir and the Aesir gods were the dominant ones, Freyja would become the most prominent goddess of Asgard, and the best known to us today, very much dominating our view of Norse religion along with Odin and Thor. Seiðr was not witchcraft as such. It was a shamanic form of magic specifically associated with the Old Norse peoples that frequently involved the study of fate and working within that to not only understand it, but also to alter it if possible. by various methods of symbolically weaving a new set of events, or even in some cases actually perhaps doing so on a real loom, twisting and altering the strands. It combined magic rituals and divination, much of it performed in an altered state of consciousness, often involving the practitioner going into a trance-like state to contact spirits from whom they could get the information they desired, induced by drumming, music, or hallucinogenic substances, and the singing of what was called a magic tune. And as I've already alluded to, it was closely associated with spinning and weaving. In fact, the name seiðr means a thread, a string, or a cord. Something, of course, also closely associated with the three Norns, who spin the fate of the world as they sit beneath the great tree of life, Yggdrasil. Part of seiðr involved changing individual destiny by altering the weave, if you like, moving the threads of the web of destiny around to produce a different outcome, good or bad, depending on the circumstances. Knowledge of creating or changing something like destiny could be used either way, for good or for bad. There was nothing good or bad about the art itself, but the use of it could go either way. Magic in itself was neither good nor bad. It was just magic. And it was the practitioners of it who decided if its use was beneficial or harmful. And of course that applies today as well. A blessing or a curse is basically the same thing, insofar as what is required to send it is concerned. The thought and the intention of the practitioner sending it, well, that is what determines if it's going to do you good or if it's going to do you harm. Seiðr could be applied to virtually any aspect of people's lives, and some of its beliefs, of course, still exist among shamanism in various countries. It was a form of magic that could give blessings or tell the future. It could help to cure the sick, assist the growing of crops, and even bring good weather. It could influence the behavior of animals. A person's destiny could be changed for the better, often by a Volva weaving a better fate on a symbolic trance-induced loom, much as the Norns did for the fate of people in general. There were a great many benefits to be obtained from it, making those who practiced it very much respected and honoured and relied on by communities that called on their services. And as I've said, their practices came from the gods themselves. Couldn't really argue with that, now could you? But as in most magic beliefs that have been followed down the ages, it was twofold. It could be used for great benefit and provide assistance and help to people, but on the other hand, it had another side, like the yin and yang. There were two parts to it, and it could also do the exact opposite. Bring curses, cause illness, kill livestock, cause injury or even death, especially in battle, and give false prophecy. So people would consult it, make the decisions, but make the wrong decisions. And just as someone's fate could be improved by weaving, so too it could be made a great deal worse by the same method. A Volva could influence people, weaving them into going to war, for example. Not all Volur were nice, kind people, I suppose. They were human, after all, and no doubt subject to anger if insulted or not recompensed sufficiently for their services. So people were careful not to upset them or interfere with them. That a Volva using her magic in an unacceptable way was truly believed in is shown by the fact that in Iceland, love poems, those things so dear to the first Volva, Freyja, were actually banned, since a spell might be secretly placed in them to force someone to love a person against their will. Oh yes. Well, you couldn't have funny stuff like that going on. No, the Icelanders were on top of that one. A Volva was essentially a seer, a sorcerer. Again, that term is actually also not gender specific, meaning one who practices sorcery. A person who could discover answers from the spirits, sometimes called a knowing woman for that reason, and often travelling around from hall to hall or village to village with her wand, performing her seiðr magic in return for food and lodging and other forms of compensation. And as I've said, they bore no physical relation whatsoever to an Egyptian mummy look-alike, as portrayed in Vikings. And he is, of course, also a man, something I'll come to in a moment. A Volva was both respected and feared during the Viking Age. No doubt for centuries before that. The art went back for thousands of years. Greatly respected for her wisdom and the great benefits she could bestow, and equally feared for the opposite things she might also bestow if offended. And for that reason, they were able to travel, even at night, alone and unarmed, anywhere, in perfect safety. No one would dare to touch her. Nobody wanted their crops to fail or their cattle to die. And when she would visit a hall, the owner, be he a powerful jarl or even a king, would give up his seat to her, giving her the seat of honour in the hall and serving her the finest mead or wine and the most succulent of food, even preparing special dishes just for her alone, as we shall see in a moment. You know, I should imagine that being a Volva was rather pleasant. One could rely on the best of board and lodgings and be deferred to even by the great and good, rather like movie stars or other celebrities today. And much like many of our celebrities now, a Volva didn't sell her services at rock bottom prices. She didn't give freebies, and she expected to be well paid or recompensed in other suitable ways. Volur graves usually contain items that suggest great wealth or high status, something that shows, well, they probably didn't do charity work. In the saga of Eric the Red, we get quite an interesting account of a Volva, where she is described as wearing a long blue cloak with stones set in it all the way down to the hem, a necklace of glass beads, and a headdress of black lambskin trimmed with white catskin. She wore a belt made of amadou, a spongy material that was used to make a form of artificial leather, and from it hung a bag which contained the various tools she needed to perform the seiðr. She wore shoes of calfskin with brass knobs on the ends of the laces, and gloves made of catskin, white and fluffy on the inside. And she carried a staff with a knob on the end, trimmed with brass and set with stones. The catskin, incidentally, would have been lynx, not house cat. When she entered the hall, she was greeted with great reverence by all those present, conveyed to the high seat of honour, and served only dishes that had been cooked especially for her, including something made from the hearts of every kind of animal they possessed, and porridge made from young goat's milk. The following day she performs a dance, standing up on a special platform, something that is mentioned frequently, Volur being up on something, be it a chair or a scaffold or a ladder. And she's surrounded by young women who sing special sacred songs that would summon the powers that the Volva wished to communicate with. Another thing that is mentioned quite often, singing and chanting to help establish a link with the spirits, as I mentioned, the magic tune. Beautiful sounds that would please and attract them. And it seems that in this case it was all a great success, and the Volva saw far ahead into the future. The so-called magic tune is also reminiscent of another form of Norse magic called Galdr, which I'll come to shortly. The magic scene in the saga of Eric the Red is very similar to an incident in the life of the famous Gudrid the Far Traveller, a remarkable woman so named because she crossed the North Atlantic 8 times, as well as going on foot right across Europe on a pilgrimage to Rome, walking from Denmark to Italy. She had come to adulthood at the time Iceland converted to Christianity in the year 1000 AD. That conversion, it would seem, for reasons of expediency and trade rather than any great religious conviction. And though she was raised a pagan, Gudrid followed the popular trend and converted to the new faith. Now, one winter's night, she and her father and some companions were feasting at the home of a man called Thorkel, who was presumably still a pagan in view of what happened afterwards, when he was visited by a seer, a Volva, named Thorbjorg, who was intending to perform pagan magic, something that was becoming rather rare in Iceland with the arrival of the new faith, and would become extremely dangerous later on as the church took full control over religious affairs. Specifically, Thorbjorg wanted to perform what were known as ward songs, for which she, like the Volva in the saga of Eric the Red, needed the women present to assist her by forming a circle and chanting, helping her to contact the spirits she required. Gudrid, however, was the only woman present who knew those magic songs, or, well, perhaps the only one who, given the changing times, wanted to actually admit to knowing them, which she had learned as a girl from her foster mother, Haldis. But she wasn't happy about it. The church frowned on such things. Oh, they really frowned, telling Thorbjorg, "These are the sort of actions in which I intend to take no part, because I am a Christian woman." But her father and Thorkel managed to persuade her that performing the chants would be beneficial for the other people present. It would be a nice thing to do. It would be a Christian thing to do, if you like. And just a bit of chanting, which she didn't even believe in anymore, well, that wouldn't harm her Christian status. Thus reassured, Gudrid performed the pagan songs with considerable skill as the other women sat in a circle around the Volva, who afterwards praised Gudrid for her rendition of the songs, never having heard them performed so beautifully. And she said that the spirits, too, had been very pleased with such a lovely performance. So everybody went home happy, and Gudrid's faith was undamaged, for which we all give thanks. But these two accounts show that For at least some seiðr magic, the participation of others was required. What I suppose today we might call a backing group. A Volva could also go to war, accompanying an army to provide magic assistance, hopefully confusing the enemy by making them not fight as well as they might do. But it was seen as women's work, and that's very important to remember. And though there were a few men who practiced the art, because of its association with women, and the possibility that women's clothing actually played a part in the rituals, and men might have to dress accordingly in women's clothing, men who practiced the art ran the risk of being considered less than manly and even being persecuted. For example, during the Christianization of Norway, the seiðr men particularly annoyed King Olaf Tryggvason. Not that he liked any pagans for that matter, and he was rather easily annoyed, but men doing women's work, well, that pissed him off. And pagan men doing women's work, well, that really took his level of pissed offness to the limit. And he had the seiðr men bound and tossed onto a rocky outcrop in the sea at low tide, there to drown rather slowly as the tide came back in, just to show everyone how really pissed off he was about it. Oh yes, he was mightily pissed off. Methods like that, of course, greatly assisted his efforts to convert his subjects to the new faith. Getting baptized was considerably better than the alternative, if King Olaf was around. You know, the really amusing thing about that attitude to male Volva is that the most famous man to practice seiðr was hardly one that anyone could have seen as even a tiny bit unmanly or effeminate, being none other than Odin himself. Yes, Odin, who was taught it by Freyja and at his own request. But even he, the great god who ruled over the 9 realms, suffered the accusations of being unmanly as a result. Loki, I suppose it would have to be Loki. Loki, for example, accused him of being ergi. That is to say, he was unmanly, cowardly, and he would accept the female role in sexual intercourse. You know, personally, if I lived in an age when great heroic manly prowess was so greatly admired, and I knew a man who went around on a massive 8-legged horse that could even run on water and fly through the air, accompanied by a pair of giant wolves, and he carried a spear that, when he threw it, couldn't miss and then returned to his hand, you know, I'd be very slow to tell him he wasn't manly, even if he was wearing a blonde wig with pretty little curls in it, a pink dress covered in flowers, and was sitting on the floor playing with dolls. No way. Given all that, I don't think the seer from Vikings would have been overly popular in Kattegat. He most certainly wouldn't have been held in high regard by everyone as he is in the show, and consulted on everything for his great wisdom and knowledge. Having a woman in the part would have been much more accurate historically, and if they'd wanted her for some reason or other to look as though they'd got her out of a glass case in the Cairo Museum, well, they could have buried her under a ton of makeup just the same. I actually worked with John Kavanagh, who plays the seer in Vikings, in Dublin's Abbey Theatre back in the early 1970s, by the way. But seiðr wasn't the only form of Norse magic, though it is frequently seen as such. All magic in the Viking Age was seiðr. If anyone Norse resorted to magic, then they used seiðr. No, they didn't. Nor were other forms of magic seen as women's work, unsuited to men. This was the case with Galdr, a separate, distinct form of magic, not connected with seiðr, though it could be used along with it, of course, and aspects of it are similar to seiðr. Its name actually meaning to chant or sing, and as its name might suggest, involving spoken or sung incantations and spells, a vocal form of magic, if you like, the use of voice to achieve the desired results rather than the altered state so frequently required in seiðr, though singing and chanting was also used in that art as well, of course. And it was used quite extensively in Galdr, it seems, for things like helping the sick, making childbirth easier for women, being one example of that. But masters of the art, and I can say master, since it did not involve any stigma when practiced by men, it was seen as largely a male art as opposed to seiðr, which is almost exclusively female. They were said to be able to make distant ships founder at sea, or to keep them afloat, raise storms, turn armor useless in battle, as well as doing nice helpful things like, well, putting out fires, for example. Galdr could also involve singing the runes, invoking the nature of each rune itself by holding it in the hand in the form of a talisman or other physical device, or painting it on the body, and then singing or chanting the name of the rune over and over and over again, producing an almost trance-like state. That is still done today in shamanic practices. and it's probably much the same as it would have been 1,000 years ago. One way I've heard it would be to repeat the name of the rune itself in full. Let us say Fehu, a rune I happen to like given its association with Freya. Fehu, Fehu, Fehu. And also its syllables. Fe, 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 hu, 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 fe, 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 hu, hu, hu. Do that for a while, and it becomes quite hypnotic. In the poem Havamal from the Poetic Edda, Odin tells of 18 magic songs that he knows, songs to cast spells, and he is talking about Galdr. And these are referred to as the 18 spell songs of Odin, stanzas 145 to 164 of Havamal. And he goes into great detail of what each song does and the fact that he knows these songs. So, since you can read these spell songs in Havamal, can you perform them yourself? Yeah, no, you can't. You see, Odin knew quite a lot of things, which he goes into great detail to tell us that he does. But unfortunately, he didn't share any of that great knowledge, simply listing all the magic songs used to cast the spells, saying what those songs would accomplish. But nowhere does he say anything about the words to use or how to perform the actual casting of the spells. Just that he knows how to do it. Great. Knowing how to do it, well, that was fine for him, but that knowledge doesn't help us very much. That is something I'll come to in a moment, and it's part of the problem that we have in understanding much of Old Norse magic, and some other things as well. Now, as I've already touched on, Galdr did not have the female associations of seiðr. It was linked more to Odin than Freya. So men practicing it would not have been considered unmanly, nor did it attract the wrath of the Christian church later on in the same way seiðr did. The church banning out of hand anything magic that had to do with women. I mean, women! How could you let them do anything? They're only here to make babies after all. Oh, gosh, couldn't have them doing stuff. The cult of Freya, being particularly annoying to the church. And anyone practicing anything to do with it, anyone even mentioning its name, would probably have been severely punished once the church was in full control. Freya's association with seiðr is demonstrated in the constellation the Greeks regarded as Orion the Hunter, a brilliant star group visible during the winter months in northern latitudes and very nice in binoculars. But it was known to the Norse as Freya's gown, with the famous belt of Orion asterism called Freya's distaff, from the distaff used in spinning, representing as it did the Volva's staff or wand. These were sometimes also associated with Frigg as well. Now, many graves have been found in Scandinavia containing women buried with a distaff or wand, as well as other items suggesting their magic role, offering bowls and talismans and various herbal substances, for example. There would hardly seem much point in burying a woman with a distaff were she not a Volva, one who had done no more with it than to spin wool, since in that case, well, why not put in the whole spinning wheel or some other parts of it, rather than just that one thing associated with magic? So graves of that type can be fairly safely classed as Volur burials, and I'll have more to say about that in a moment. There were other forms of magic in the Viking Age as well as Galdr and seiðr, such as Sutta Ute, a shamanic practice that involved invoking the powers of darkness, which was performed at night, rather obviously I suppose since darkness was required, by sitting at a crossroads perhaps, and chanting invocations in order to get the counsel of the spirits of the dark or to learn secrets. Now, while aspects of Sutta Ute were similar to both seiðr and Galdr, it was a specific thing in itself rather than being an offshoot of either of the other two. So, what sort of rituals did the Volur actually perform? Yes, they chanted, they sang magic tunes, they went into trances and so forth. But how did they do that? What did they say? What words were spoken? What tunes were sung? There, as I said, we have a problem. The answer is, well, we haven't the faintest idea. We know a lot about what they did, but not about how they did it, from the point of the words spoken, the gestures used. There's no record of that, at least from the Norse people themselves at that time, though there are accounts by travellers, like the Arab Ahmed ibn Faddam, who witnessed a Kievan Rus burial ceremony in what is now Russia. But how closely the Rus shamanic rituals mirrored the original Norse ceremonies they derived from, I suppose impossible to say, though I suppose they would have been either the same or very close. His eyewitness account does give an interesting glimpse of one aspect of Volva's duties. Now, Norsemen have established themselves around Novgorod, circa 862 AD, later becoming known as the Kievan Rus, from the city of Kiev. In 921, Ibn Fadlan travelled with a delegation from the Caliph of Baghdad to the Bulgars on the Volga River, and there he witnessed the funeral of a Rus chieftain, with an old woman presiding over the event, directing it, who was called the Angel of Death, almost certainly a Volva. The man's ship was pulled ashore, and on it a bed was made by this woman, and the man's body was placed on the bed with his weapons and offerings around him, and 2 horses were killed and added, and the woman sacrificed a hen and a cock. A thrall girl was chosen to accompany her master into the next world, and she then had sex with a number of men, each of the men saying, "Tell your master that I do this because of my love for him." Yes, I'm sure there was no shortage of volunteers for the task of telling her master how much they loved him. The girl was lifted up on the palms of several men 3 times by a door frame, given intoxicating drinks, and thus put into a psychic state so she could look through the symbolic doorway into the next world. This ritual, incidentally, is confirmed by an Icelandic story of how 2 men lift up a woman over a door frame to enable her to look into the next world. She was then taken to the ship, and she gave her bracelets to the Volva and her other jewellery to the woman's daughters, who it seems were guarding her, and the Volva gave her more intoxicating drinks, the girl then singing and bidding farewell to those around her. She went into the tent that had been erected over the funeral bed, and men began banging their shields as 6 others came into the tent and had sex with the thrall girl before putting her into the bed with her dead master. 2 men then held her feet, 2 others held her hands, and the Volva put a rope around her neck, 2 men taking the ends and pulling it tight as she pushed a knife between the girl's ribs, killing her. The ship was then set on fire, and later on a cairn and a mound was built over it. While the Norse people could write, they had a written language using the runes, first the elder Futhark and then the younger Futhark rune systems, the latter being the one used most during the so-called Viking Age. But unfortunately, they never used them to write books. They could have, but they didn't. They never wrote down their history or their religious beliefs, using the runes instead for, well, inscriptions on monuments. The Ragnar went somewhere and never came back, or Sigurd was a great hero, sort of thing. They used them as decorations. They put them on talismans and rings to bring good luck. They used them in meditation and chants, as in Galdr. And the Volur would have used them, but the Norse never recorded anything in detail as to their daily life and customs. There was no seiðr for dummies sort of book that we can consult. Their history, their customs, their religion, just about everything else comes down to us either in a handful of accounts by foreign travellers, such as Ibn Fadlan, or in the form of stories, verbal tales that were recounted by wandering poets and storytellers called skalds, who went from hall to hall, relating these tales of gods and heroes. But those verbal tales, the Norse or Icelandic sagas as they are known, weren't actually written down until often centuries after they were being related by the skalds, finally committed to parchment only in the 13th century, and by Christians, people who did not share the beliefs of those who had created the sagas, and were inclined to alter them a bit to make them more acceptable to Christian readers, and more importantly, to the Christian Church. Most of our knowledge of Norse religious beliefs we owe to the prose Edda, written in Iceland by Snorri Sturluson, who lived 1179 to 1241 AD, and to another Icelandic work entitled the Codex Regius, or the Royal Book, which dates from around 1270, and from which we get the collected anonymous poems and stories that form the Poetic Edda, as well as the works of the Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus, or Saxo the Learned, who lived 1160 to 1220. But all of these were written long after the days when the sagas had actually been composed and told by the skalds, stories that have been handed down over the years by word of mouth, and very probably altered in the process, as anything by word of mouth tends to be as it goes from one person to another. And then they were written down by Christians more than 200 years after the pagan religion had all but ceased to exist. So they have to be seen in the context of pagan stories retold from a Christian viewpoint. So even though men like Snorri were trying to preserve these traditions, passing on the skills of Norse poetry to future generations, we can't be sure how much was altered so as to make it more palatable to Christians. And detailed descriptions of actual pagan rituals would probably have been omitted, even if they were actually mentioned in the sagas and poems to begin with, since the 13th century church would have seen such things as devil worship, and recounting them in enough detail to make it possible to actually use them Well, I mean, that would have been seen as tantamount to telling people how to summon Satan or his minions. There are no real details of the actual incantations or prayers as such, either in seiðr or Galdr. While we are told in the saga of Eric the Red and in the tale of Gudrid the Far Traveller that Volur danced or chanted and so forth, we know about the magic tune and that women sang to accompany them. But we don't know the actual words that were used or details of how the animal bones and talismans were used, how they were placed or what the wording was of any incantations that were said over them. We don't know any special gestures or signs that were used. Unlike the early liturgy of the Christian church, which we have in written form. And well, we could recreate a mass from the 12th century, for example, if we wanted to, but we can't recreate those seiðr ceremonies correctly because we don't have the script, you might say. It would be like trying to figure out the text of Hamlet. If all you know is that his uncle killed his father, he found out about it, he was really pissed, but he was too weak to do anything about it, and he talks to a skull. You know, that wouldn't get you a very great or accurate performance. The actual wording of many of the ceremonies of the Volur probably weren't even in the original verbal tales, even if only because a skald wouldn't have wanted to repeat them. They were magic after all, and I doubt a skald would have been very keen to actually repeat a magic formula in case, well, whoosh, something happened. And even if they had been given in detail, it's very doubtful that Snorri or Saxo would have even considered putting them on parchment. That was the sort of thing that got one invited to a spectacular barbecue in the town square, attended by the whole populace. Unfortunately, you were the barbecue. The sad fact is that no actual spells have survived from the Viking Age. Spells and incantations are mentioned frequently in the sagas and the poems, but that is all. No actual proper text of any of them has come down to us. And the various mentions of them give us no idea of how they were actually performed. For example, the stanzas from Hávamál that I've already quoted, where Odin lists 18 important spell songs that he knows, but he doesn't tell us how to cast those spells, what the words are, or how they should be performed, actually sung, or perhaps rhythmically chanted or spoken. He tells us what they do in great detail, and that he knows how to use them. And that's all. He may have known how to use them, but we don't. Now, there are later manuscripts from Iceland, dating from the early 17th century, over 600 years after the conversion of Iceland, and so not exactly contemporary with the Viking Age by a long way, but these manuscripts purport to give spells and magic symbols from that era, but they are highly questionable. Much of the symbolism seems more akin to the later black magic of Christian times than of anything genuinely used during the Old Norse period, and was probably a product of church influence. But one well-known symbol, for example, the Helm of Or. While that name is indeed mentioned in one of the old epic poems, thus establishing the later manuscript as accurate, or so it seems at first sight, reading that old tale carefully, it appears that it was an actual helmet, something like this one, not just a symbol. Of course, it's possible that the symbol was painted on the front of the helmet, and that fact was lost in translation, you might say, as the tale was handed down or written down later, though one would have to ask, how did those who wrote it down know what it looked like in that case? Though again, I suppose that could have been verbally described. Another symbol, and here's the problem one. Another symbol was said to have been used after digging up a body from a churchyard. Yes, a churchyard, not a burial mound, a ship burial, a stone cairn, no, from a churchyard. And a churchyard, of course, places it firmly in Christian times. So the whole manuscript is highly questionable. So we know little about the actual rituals performed by the Volur, though of course we can guess at much of it, based on shamanic rituals practiced elsewhere, since there are commonly recurring themes found in most forms of shamanism right across the world. Drums, cymbals, animal skins and bones, horned headdresses, dancing, the use of natural medicines and hallucinatory substances, chanting and the like. Well, that can be found almost universally. So that is a clue to Norse Volur practice. Of course, that doesn't say that they did or didn't do any particular one of those things, but certainly it seems likely that their practices would have been similar to those of peoples living close to them, the nearby Slavic lands, for example, or the northern Germanic tribes, of which we have much better historical information. But it is clear that contacting the spirits played a part in Volur rituals, as well as the more mundane, everyday things like healing injuries or casting spells. From what we can piece together, we can say with certainty that a Volva would put herself into a trance, which enabled her to communicate with the spirits, using drum beats, singing and chanting, as well as hallucinatory substances, to enter the trance state. assisted by women whose singing would please the required spirits and gain their cooperation, if their singing was beautiful enough to please and attract the spirits, of course, with the Volva placing herself above her surroundings, either on a chair or a platform, or even lifted up by those around her, thus enabling her to see more clearly into the spirit realm, she being then in a place between the realms of the living and the spirits. And when the music and singing faded, people could ask her questions about what lay in store for them or whatever else they might wish to know. This lifting in order to see beyond is, of course, clearly described in Ibn Fadlan's account of the Rus funeral, though not what words were said, of course. It seems to that a Volva could also go on a spirit journey, leaving her own body to travel elsewhere, possibly even entering the body of an animal, though exactly how that was done isn't clear, nor indeed why it might be done, though I suppose the obvious reason would be to gather information from some distant place or person. Out-of-body spirit journeys are still performed today, of course, if you believe those who claim to do it, and there is evidence to support those claims. I actually know someone who has done it. But again, we still don't know the exact words that were used, the gestures, or the exact use of amulets or animal bones. We don't know if there was a required specific magic tune that had to be used, or if someone could just make one up as they went along. So while today we could use various methods of going into a trance, that's not hard to do. While sitting up on top of something, being lifted up by people, surrounded by women singing a nice melody and banging on drums, which would indeed be what a Volva and her assistants would have done. But we would still not be performing a genuine Norse ceremony as a Volva would have performed it. Our words would not be her words. Our chants and incantations would not be those of 1,000 years ago. Our song would not be their song. So while we might end up with something similar to what she would have done, it would still not be a Volva ceremony. An impression of one, perhaps, but that is all. Unlike early Christian, Jewish, or Muslim rituals, which we can reproduce fairly accurately, because we know not only what they did, but also how they did it. For an excellent idea of what shamanic rituals might have looked and sounded like, I would recommend having a look on YouTube for the German shamanic experimental folk group Heilung, which comprises members from Germany, Norway, and Denmark, and who give a remarkable visual performance, quite apart from their music, which can be truly awesome and very hypnotic, very much in the Galdr tradition, I should think, of the repetition of sound. The lead vocalist, Marie of France, has a remarkable voice, and her costume with antler, headdress, and amulets is probably a very good representation of what many of Volva would have looked like, based on costumes worn by other shamanic practitioners, as indeed are the costumes worn by all the members and the various props, excellent representations of that age. Now, Scandinavian archaeologists have discovered wands in about 40 female graves, and they have usually been discovered in the graves of women who, by the valuable items buried with them, show that they belonged to the highest level of Norse society, whether by actual birth into good families or simply by acquiring wealth due to their profession. There was a very fine and rich grave discovered in the ring fortress of Freikat on the Jutland Peninsula in Denmark, the richest grave in the area, in fact, dated to the 9th century, and containing a woman wearing a long blue and red dress with white sleeves, and a headscarf trimmed with gold, which seemed to be of the sort of thing that a noble person would have, buried on a horse-drawn wagon from which the wheels had been removed. Well, that in itself set the grave apart, no less than less well-off family was going to waste a perfectly good wagon by putting a body in it. She had a metal wand, a clear indication of her status, silver rings on her toes, something not found in any other grave in Scandinavia, actually, and various items from the Slavic lands that are now Russia, as well as Finland and Gothland, were in the grave. By her head was a gold-plated box brooch decorated with silver, which contained white lead, a substance used in various forms for thousands of years in medicinal ways, and may also have been intended for makeup purposes as well, which was one of the things it was also used for, giving the face a pale, whitish look, rather like a Japanese geisha girl, which would have given her a very strange, otherworldly appearance when performing her magic. But it was also very dangerous to use it in that way, since it is poisonous if it's absorbed through the skin. At her feet was her seiðr box, containing her magic tools, such as bones from small animals and birds, an owl pellet, and a pouch of henbane seeds. Now, these seeds thrown into a fire would give off a strong hallucinogenic smoke that would give a sense of flying, in anyone inhaling it. And rubbing it on the skin could also produce hallucinations, something still used today by practitioners of some forms of witchcraft and known as witches' salve. There was also a silver amulet representing a chair, and silver chair amulets of this type are only ever found in female graves, suggesting that they may represent the raised platform on which we know that the Volur performed their magic on occasions, as well, of course, as the chair on which Odin sat as he surveyed the world from Asgard. 2 bronze bowls were beside her, possibly used for mixing potions, and indeed several already mixed potions were discovered in the grave, but it wasn't possible to identify what they were. Everything about this woman suggests that she was wealthy and would have been very important in her own locality. The famous Osberg ship, discovered in Norway, the ship dated to 800 AD, but the burials contained in it dated to the autumn of 834 AD, may well have contained a Volva, one of the 2 women in it having been buried with a wooden wand, a rather unlikely item for anyone but a Volva to possess. And there was a pouch of cannabis seeds. There was also a fine Volva grave found in Östergötland in Sweden, dating from the 9th century, with a woman buried with her wand and an assortment of very valuable items, including a wagon, several horses in a grave, always an indicator of wealth and position, and a bronze pitcher from Arabia, as well as a silver amulet thought to represent Freya, the most famous Volva, of course, with her golden necklace blessing them. This amulet, actually, is a reproduction of that one, the original now in the National Museum of Sweden. Also in Sweden, a Volva and a warrior were actually buried together in Birka, with a spear ceremoniously placed above them, thought to be a dedication to Odin, both having served him, one with a sword, the other with a wand. Some Volva wands have been found that don't seem to be associated with the distaff, but seem more likely to represent a phallus, which would tie in with known sexual associations with magic in Old Norse society, so that it's more than possible that the magic of the Volur could have included sexual rites. Now, the Volur are actually known for being very well versed in the art of seduction, one reason they could be feared at times. And one stanza in Havamal gives a warning against actually having sexual intercourse with them, since doing so carried the risk of being trapped in a magic bond and could also result in becoming ill. The very free sexual life led by Freya, first mistress of seiðr, has to be borne in mind in that context, insofar as the pleasant activities of the goddess in Asgard could have been seen as divine approval for a similar lifestyle in Midgard, since the Volva was Freya's counterpart, her representative, if you like, in the human realm. That seduction was something that a Volva might engage in does seem to have some support, considering the grave in Thrykat, where henbane was discovered, which when burned or rubbed on the skin produces not only strong hallucinations, but it's also a powerful aphrodisiac. And that would make a perfect combination if one wanted to seduce someone while using magic. The distaff possessed great magical powers in Norse mythology, since spinning the fate of the world and its inhabitants with thread was the task of the 3 Norns. And many of the Volur ones that have been discovered have a distinctive basket-like feature at the top, similar to distaffs used for spinning linen. Now, here is an excellent reproduction of this type of Volur distaff. This one having been made specially for my friend Andrea Allman, and I'm using the image here with her kind permission, as well as on the thumbnail for the video. And you see here the basket-like thing on the end. As I say, that is a brilliant reproduction of one of these wands. Since the Norse believed that the Norns could control the fate of everything by their spinning, it would seem quite logical to think that the Volur could influence the fate of an individual by the same method. But with the coming to Scandinavia of a new faith that had its origins in distant Palestine, which began in the latter part of the 10th century, and the vigorous and brutal way it was often forced on the people by rulers like Olaf Tryggvason, that kind-hearted and lovable gentleman, destroying pagan temples and images with grim determination, executing some practitioners of seiðr, and torturing or killing anyone who refused to convert, really giving his people 2 choices, convert or suffer the consequences, the old ways began to disappear. And by the 11th century, the Christian god had largely replaced the gods of Asgard, and the Volur and their seiðr magic faded from history. Hardly surprising, considering the effort put into the conversion by both church and state, which in reality were one and the same thing. We have a very interesting document from 10th century England, where the drive to stamp out pagan beliefs was pretty much the same as it was in Scandinavia. And this is the 16th canon of the Anglo-Saxon canon law, enacted by King Edgar, who would have got on very well, I think, with King Olaf. Two minds with but a single thought. And it says, I've used the English translation for the Anglo-Saxon terms, if any witch, wizard, false swearer, worshipper of the dead, or any foul, contaminated, manifest whore be anywhere in the land, man shall drive them out. We teach that every priest shall extinguish heathendom and forbid fountain worship, incantations of the dead, omens, magic, man worship, and the abominations that men exercise in various sorts of witchcraft, and in peace enclosures, with elms and other trees, and with stones, and with many phantoms. Well, I mean to say, you couldn't have that sort of thing going on now, could you? Yeah. Now, the conversion of Scandinavia was very often only nominally so to begin with. The saying, he who is convinced against his will remains of the same opinion still, is very true, and the old ways lingered on for some time, though usually in secret. But eventually they died out almost completely, apart from a few places like Iceland, where many old beliefs and traditions remained just below the surface, until a remarkable revival of Old Norse pagan beliefs and practices in our own century, with hofs, or temples, dedicated to the gods of Asgarda being constructed in Denmark and in Iceland. And even the United States military has recently allowed service personnel to wear Mjolnir, the hammer of Thor, as a sign of faith, and recognize pagan belief alongside that of Christians, Jews, and Muslims. It wouldn't be correct to say that the Volur vanished completely after the full Christianization of the Norse lands. Shamanism in some form continued, practiced in secret here and there by individuals who still held to old beliefs in the forces of nature and the spirits. But the Volur with her distaff, traveling the Scandinavian countryside, practicing her art, was a thing of the past. The church was unforgiving of evil pagan witchcraft, and anyone caught doing it could expect a very short lifespan, ended rather painfully. But pagan beliefs and rituals lived on in spite of that, especially in other countries where there were indigenous peoples who would have been seen as primitive, and thus nobody from the civilized world really gave a rat's ass what they believed in, or what kind of crazy mumbo-jumbo things they did. Good heavens, I mean, they were just natives, don't you know? I mean to say, who on earth would take any notice of anything persons of that type was doing? Totally absurd, what? Yes. Shamanic practices continued strongly in Siberia, for example, or among the Native Americans. Nobody actually tried to stop them because, well, nobody really cared what they did. There wasn't a King Olaf around to put a stop to it. Old Norse beliefs managed to retain a hold in Iceland to a considerable extent, even if often only subconsciously, since religious fervour in that island never reached the levels it did in Europe, in Spain, France, or Italy, for example. And the conversion of Iceland had more to do with trade than it did religion, since King Olaf had stopped all trade with Iceland. Trade which the country needed to survive, and he threatened to kill important Icelandic hostages he was holding as an incentive for conversion. Very, very religious that was. Added to that, other Christian countries were reluctant to trade with Iceland, since trade with pagans was actually forbidden by the church. So, Iceland converted, all at once, in the year 1000 AD. Instantly, almost everybody was a Christian, or at least they said they were, and the few who weren't were allowed to go on being pagans, which just keep it discreet. The decision was taken by one man, the law speaker of the All Thing, the assembly where laws were enacted and topics discussed, and he, one man, decided that all Icelanders were now officially Christian. You know, that fact in itself casts rather considerable doubt on the actual religious sincerity of the conversion of the masses. It was just a sensible thing to do. But even today in Iceland, there is a genuine belief, even, as I said, if it's often subconsciously, in many of the old ways. Painted stones outside houses, for example, to welcome the Landvatir, the guardian spirits of the land. And sacred stones that children are not allowed to play on and are never mowed closely because they are inhabited by the Landvatir. An airfield runway being built on one occasion was actually delayed for a couple of weeks because the workmen wouldn't move a sacred stone until the Landvatir had been told and given time to leave it. That was a genuine belief, something you'd hardly find that anywhere else. If a foreman told his boss something like that here in Ireland, Sure, no, sir. No, we can't be moving that stone today. No, not at all, sir. We need to give the little people, the leprechauns, like, time to move out of it, so we do. I can't be annoying the little people. Well, the nice men in the white coats would come to take him to the padded room where he wouldn't hurt himself. There are women today who, well, they may not travel around distaff in hand to the homes of the great and noble for delicious banquets of assorted hearts, nor do they chuck henbane into fires and seduce unsuspecting men. They do practice some rituals much the same as those the Volur would have performed 1,000 years ago. And some aspects of the ancient art can also be found, of course, in spiritualism and in psychic mediums. But a true Viking Age Volva does not exist anymore. People who may be similar in some aspects, but even, perhaps even identical in a few, yes, but the Volva as she existed in the Viking Age with her staff, etc., is as gone as the famous longship. While certain ideas and rituals might be the same or similar, so much that a Volva would have done is not performed in our time, some of it not even believed in, and some of it, of course, isn't legal anymore. Changing the weather, weaving a person's fate for better or worse, using henbane or other hallucinatory substances to seduce or influence people, killing livestock, or indeed people, making people ill, accompanying an army into battle, cursing those you didn't like, all perfectly normal things expected of a Volva 1,000 years ago, especially one you'd pissed off somehow. But if attempted today, well, it would get you either classed as mentally unsound and in need of professional help, or locked up in jail, or possibly both. Now, that's not to say those things didn't work. I'm sure they did. A Volva who couldn't actually do anything would have been very quickly discovered to be either incompetent or a fraud. But in these days of, if it can't be scientifically proven in a lab, it don't exist. Or herbal remedies are ridiculous. Plants can't cure illness, despite the simple logic that some plants can affect your body so strongly they can kill you, hemlock, foxglove, or mistletoe, for example, then others could do so in a beneficial manner. People are so unwilling to even consider the possibility that something based on natural laws, on nature, on the understanding of the relationship between the elements, that such things could have any genuine effect. When people say to me, plants can't have any effect on the human body, it's ridiculous, I just say, well, swig down a nice glass of hemlock and see what happens. It didn't do a whole lot for Socrates. A very good and easy to comprehend example of natural forces at work is the moon, 300,000 miles away, and yet able to pull our oceans up and down, many billions and billions of tons of water, causing the tides. A very dear friend of mine, Lorraine, is a witch in what we might call the Irish shamanic tradition. It dates back long before the coming of Christianity to Ireland, back to the Celtic Druids. And she has impressed me with her knowledge and the use of various practices, using energy from her hands, for example, for healing, which she has actually used on me. So that's not just hearsay. I mean, I've been there. And she is remarkably well versed in herbal remedies and folklore. And another close friend, Aliana, practices some things that might well have been used by the Volur 1,000 years ago. Working with runes would be one example, using them to get energies to assist with improving people's lives, helping them to bring good things and give benefits to others as well as herself. And it has worked. I asked her how she describes herself and her work, since I thought it would be nice to end this look at magic in the past with a look at a practitioner of magic in our own time, who I actually know. And if anyone wishes to contact her, they may do so. She's not a Volva as such, but her use of aspects of Old Norse practices, such as bind runes, and her devotional connection with Freya and other deities make her very much in their mold, if not actually one of them. Both she and Lorraine, I think, would have been quite at home 1,000 years ago in Scandinavia. Now, this is what she wrote. Ariana Cochrane, aka Liana Dragonheart. I am the founder of the Center for Eclectic Cosmology, which is in the process of becoming a legal entity. And I call myself an eclectic cosmologist to identify my personal path. In order to help people understand my spiritual healing work, I describe myself as a shamanic-inspired witch, because while I have worked with and been guided by spirits ever since I can remember, I don't have shamanic training or come from a culture that has shamans or their equivalent. As to my healing work, my first physical level teacher, Cora Diva, described my approach as being a karmic therapist, paralleling a physical therapist. As a physical therapist helps individuals relearn important body functions after injury or illness, and or helps people learn entirely new processes to improve their individual quality of life. I often refer to myself as a spiritual instructor, based on the old proverb, if you give a person a fish, that person eats one time. If you teach the person how to fish, that person can feed themselves. To which I add, that person can pay it forward and teach others how to fish. My work is geared toward empowerment and self-sufficiency. I work with spiritual, emotional, and mental patterns, attitudes, beliefs, etc., to help the individual shift attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, choices, and self-expression to shift their responses to the world around them and receive a new, healthier experience in their own quality of life. I am also the creator of the name mandalas, which are a tool I use to help with self-acceptance. At the moment, I am not accepting any new clients, but I can be reached on Dragon Dreamers Trading Post at hotmail.com. So, with that, we come to the finale of this look at the Volur, the shamans of the Vikings. You know, that should, I suppose, really be the shamans of the Norse, since the term Viking, or Vikinger, as it was in Old Norse, only applied to those who got in a ship and went somewhere in it and did something when they got to wherever it was they got to. As long as they didn't get in a ship, they were just Danes, Swedes, or Norwegians. So, I hope you've enjoyed it. If you did, that you will like, perhaps subscribe to my channel. So, until next time, I shall say farewell. Goodbye for now.